we'd like to thank our panelists, and we have some time for questions. We have a good half hour for questions, so perhaps if anybody would like to start, please, I will just sort of field the questions. Yes.
So, Jack, I have a question. You were talking about disturbed affiliation, and then you mentioned the South, the capital S, South being having an illegitimate foundation, and you gestured toward what affiliation means for Lisson and the tracing of the genealogy. But you also implied that there were some more, there's like a larger philosophical weight that's carried behind that, and you suggested that we could talk about it. So I'm wondering if you maybe wanted to say what it was you wanted to get out on the table.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. In the back? Okay. Yeah, there were many points in the paper where I made myself really resist elaborating on some of the finer points, I would say, of the philosophical argument that in specifically Faulkner, Mississippi is very implicit because it's elaborated in other works of Lisson that are more sort of, if you will, philosophical or theoretical, though that doesn't really work categorically, but as it is, we can keep it there. But, so affiliation, I mean, I would say that Lisson's use of affiliation is coming from Deleuze and Guattari, who describe it in all sorts of different ways, in capacities, in Thousand Plateaus, and they're looking at Lévi-Strauss. So that's the kind of genealogy of that concept. But I just wanted to stress the fact that it's what's very wonderful and practical about Lisson's philosophy, and what I tried to elaborate is that it functions at various levels of abstraction, and so we can talk about a concept like filiation, which is literally just lineage, but it also indexes this broader problem, which is that there's a desire and a very intense anxiety to be able to trace lineage, which, as we know, is impossible. And so in Faulkner, the kind of emphasis on Scotland and Scottishness and all of this kind of stuff is, I think, precisely that, fantasy affiliation to Europe that is fraudulent, essentially.
There was another question. Yes.
So now we have time for questions.
We have time for questions.
I will ask many questions in that case. One to each of our first three speakers at least. I mean, for Salim, I think, so basically, what you were describing about Fabrion's novel, structurally speaking, in terms of the alienated subject or the African immigrant in exile in France. So out of this, as you know, I mean, there is a whole tradition of the Francophone sub-Saharan novel, and in a sense, the beginning of this tradition is precisely about the alienated subject, etc. So if you begin with early 1920s with Ayoub, and then you have Saussé, Mirage de Paris, or Semben with Le Cœur Noir, structurally speaking, most of what you were pointing at could be said of these three novels and other novels as well, even though they relate to a situation that is happening in the 20s or 30s or 50s, even though some of them are at the high power of the French colonial power, French colonial empire, when it decides to stop assimilating. That's for Diallo, and then for the 50s, it's just before the end of the empire, and then for Fatou, it's now. And so in all of these very different social situations, you have basically structurally the same kind of aspects as the one you were pointing at. So my question to you is, how can we relate what you were describing in terms of alienation to a situation that would be the contemporary situation of immigration if we find the same kind of features or characteristics in the long-standing tradition? That's my first question. But I will ask the three in a row if you allow me. So my second question is about the invisibility or erasure of race in contemporary France. It could be argued that it's erased, at least politically speaking, because you cannot have statistics about that. But in the 19th century, until the 1940s, 1950s, race is absolutely central and absolutely not invisible in France. It's at the basis of the expansion of colonial power. And what happens in the erasure or relative erasure of race in France is due to two things. One is the extermination of Jews during World War II, and the other is the end of the French colonial empire. So, if we take history before that, racism, as we know, racism is largely a French invention. That's one of the, if French want to be proud of something, they can be proud of having invented Gobineau and basically having built the structure of extermination in many countries. So the problem is, should we complain so much about the taboo or invisibility of race today, in the light of what race has played, of the kind of role race has played before in French expansion and imperialism? My last question, very quick, to Jack. What about poetics? I mean, is there something about Faulkner's poetics that could also be tied to the unpredictable that is at the basis of theorization by contrast with design?
Okay.
Salim, you want to
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what makes Joan in a way different from the other authors you've mentioned is her current political and mediatic exposure in France, not only in France and also in Africa, which wasn't the case for Sembène, for instance. This exposure makes her more politically engaged, and she is not just delving uniquely, I would say, on alienation or global influence or the intricate relation that links them. She is also kind of trying through her writing, through her oeuvre in general, not just Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, to alleviate this state of alienation, not only point to it. It's just not romance, mere romance. So, I mean, if I understand your question well.
So yeah, thank you for your question. I think that it's not really about the way she wrote the novel. She doesn't want to feel a complaint about race, but more to acknowledge the fact that race is something real in France, not in biological terms, because there's only human race, but in terms of social and political impacts. So the fact that the characters are being portrayed in a way that they cannot express that, because it really limits the speech and the social speech about race. The fact that, since you said, since World War II is being kind of a taboo concept because of all the consequences that we know. So she kind of wants to put it forward, but not for its biological relevance, but more to create a national speech, if we want to say that. So, for example, Pape Ndiaye in the La Condition Noire highlight the fact that because we don't have, as you highlighted, any we don't know how many people from Sub-Saharan Africa we have, or people from North Africa. So it creates lots of. You cannot point out discrimination in France. It's very hard, for example, to be discriminated in terms of job, at university, at anything. It's very hard to prove it because there is no such numbers, and it's hard to say, oh, I've been discriminated because of racism or because of a skin color, because there is no such thing as race. No, there's no race in France. So I believe that's kind of what she wants to say, not really in terms of complaint, but in terms of the necessity of a national speech and of a discussion among politicians and citizens about what are the impacts of race today. I believe it's really in those terms that we should understand the book.
I understand that. I would just add that for most of its history with the French Colonial Empire was acknowledging the existence
Yeah, yeah,
of race,
exactly.
and that was creating discrimination.
Yeah, it praised that,
slavery,
but
and so
but it was very sudden, the fact of saying, oh, okay, so before we had 4
That was
races,
sudden.
and all of a sudden, no, race doesn't exist as the Constitution said, whatever, okay, that's how it is. So it was very sudden, but the impacts of it still remain. So I believe that's what she wants to kind of point out, to say, okay, we still have that, although the official discourse is saying that it doesn't exist. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
I have a sort of provisional answer for you, Laurent, but if it's not what you're looking for, we can continue to try to figure it out. So the question about poetics, I think, speaks to some of the things that I really wish I had a lot more time to talk about. But Blisson, he continually refers to Faulkner's project as a poetics, which I think is interesting, considering what we're looking at is a saga of novels, right? So I think that, in considering the question, at least from Blisson's perspective of the Baroque, as Baroque understood as the in the American context as a kind of horizontalization, a filling up of the surface, if you will, kind of excess, that sort of thing. He's interested in the way that models contamination and says that that's why within these spaces the Baroque is the chosen genre, if you will. But in terms of just the question of Baroque versus something else, I mean, I think that within the context of minor literature becoming minor, creolization, if we see all of those things existing within a certain kind of genealogy, that the Baroque style, which he says Faulkner has his own kind of Baroque, which he opposes to a kind of Louisianais, something more métisé, maybe something like that. On the other side, you have Kafka, which is this kind of sobriety, like making the language sober is the form of making it minor. And so I would oppose those two things to each other because I think that they are different, have different meanings. But in general, I think poetics for Blisson is an indication of a very specific kind of change, and that as opposed to métissage, which has what I described as the additive logic of synthesis, which is you take one thing, put it with one thing, and get a third thing that looks like those two things. Using poetics as a schema of understanding how social change happens within the material philosophical conditions shows us the way that newness is generated, and that we're not talking about simply a syncretic combination of elements, but rather something that is produced through an aleatory method that we don't know what's going to happen, sensibly. And so I think that poetics, in that way, is the model for this philosophical tradition in general of the way that we understand phenomena to unfold in general. Does that get to?
Yeah, but we can continue afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question for Jackqueline. And a comment and a question. And the thing about both the cockfight metaphor and the cat and mouse metaphor is that they are really ahistorical, right? So they're making these, in both of them have a perpetuality to them, right? The eternality of like, you're always going to be the cat and mouse, you're going to fight to the death, right? But of course that fight is suspended throughout time. But I thought that was really genius. But what I wanted to ask about was that moment when the midwife said, if I wasn't here, she'd have to be like me, right? So it's interesting, the difference between the narrative voice and the authorial voice, because basically she's saying, I am here in order to preserve a coloniality of power that you get to live without being aware of in your position as the master or the mistress of the house. But I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how a decolonial model might provide insight into that scene. And this isn't a question as much as a comment for Salim. I really appreciated the alienation being brought to the home because, you know, and I know it's the novel that makes that possible to do, but that idea that alienation isn't actually about where you are, but it's about a kind of globally mediated belonging that actually doesn't exist for the immigrant or the person who stays at home in either place. That was really great.
Thank you so much. I think that the decolonial framework can be really helpful here in the sense that I brought up the concept of the decoloniality of gender and the ways in which gender has to be understood as racialized through coloniality. And so I mentioned how, you know, it's taking the model of European patriarchy where European men are superior to European women, but then European women, and then in this case, like women with European features in the New World, are then superior hierarchically to all racialized people, including her servant in this novel. But also, I think that the distinction between humanitas and anthropos is useful too, because that moment where she's talking about the giving birth out in the cane fields, it almost evokes like an animal, like, you know, cow giving birth out in the fields, as opposed to the rest of the scene is you know, this, you know, white Dominican woman is in the comfort of, you know, her huge hacienda, and like the embroidery and like all these beautiful details, and she has all these silk and satin like sheets that she's on, and so it's all elaborately, like, she is granted humanitas, like there's no question about that. So I think that the decolonial model really helps us to tease out the differences, the ways in which Señora Valencia is like the epitome of humanitas, and the ways in which Amabel is completely excluded from that.
You know, before actually coming to this panel this morning, I was also thinking of the ways in which this panel might be fitting into others for the entire conference. And I don't know if this was mentioned yesterday at all, just thinking in terms of, you know, is geography destiny, which was the question I had, and I don't know if that was raised. So that a geography of the South, you know, it's easy to sort of say, well, no, it's not destiny, you know, because we're not thinking of destiny as determinism. So that if you're from a certain place, that this is what is going to happen to you. No. But if we were to think of a geography of the South that is also connected to destiny as something fabricated, that is, say, a narrative that we make in order to make movement happen in migration, immigration, and so on, so that destiny, in fact, is more affective, right? So that it obliges you to leave a particular space, right? So that, in fact, one of the things that's come out to me in listening to your papers as well is just to think of, if we were to think of that, you know, destiny as an affective sort of creation, then in all of yours, the movement is also attached to racializing. You know, so that if it's labor, it's connected to racializing particular populations, etc. So that destiny can't be seen as just sort of a purely abstract, I'm moving to another place for economic benefits, but how you enter that space is already sort of embedded in a whole set of discourses about race. You know? So I don't mean that as a comment. I was just going to see if anybody, you know, had anything to say about that at all before we close, because in fact we have less time than I thought. Any comments? John?
I have a quick comment. Yeah, so in Samuel Martinez's critique of the fatal conflict model, you know, where they're fighting to the death, he plays on the word fatal. And, you know, as fatal as in, you know, to the death, but also fatal as in destiny. And he critiques how that's just wrong. As you're saying, like, you know, his geography destiny, he completely disagrees with that. And I think he and also Dantica and myself really are hoping to, like, envision a future in which there can be a Dominican and Haitian solidarity, which would completely go against any sort of, you know, predestined narrative of this cockfighter.
Right. Yeah, because the denials of privatization, for example, is one way to look at, you know, also, you know, this affective in understanding of destiny. Maybe one more question? Maybe not. We thank our panelists very much for the questions. We have a 10-minute break now before